All right, so in this video, we're going to continue going through the process of decolonization. And in this video, we're going to cover decolonization in the Middle East, in North Africa, and in Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, remember, this whole process is driven by two big components. First, the colonial powers in Europe, and at this point it's pretty much just the British and the French, can't really afford to maintain their empires. They're too expensive. They're trying to rebuild from World War II, and there are growing nationalist movements in most of these colonies, and those are expensive to put down. The other big component here is that the Soviet Union, and to a lesser extent China, oppose imperialism. And so they're helping the colonies gain independence. So they oppose imperialism on principle because socialism argues that in capitalism, rich people exploit poor people. Imperialism is just capitalism on a global scale. So rich countries exploit poor countries. And so on principle, socialists oppose imperialism. But because this is happening during the Cold War, they also oppose imperialism because this weakens Western powers like Great Britain and France and the United States. So by helping these colonies, they're fulfilling their obligation to socialism, but they're also hurting their ideological opponent right now in the Cold War, principally the United States. All right, so we're going to look at three places, and we're going to start in the Middle East. And you might also see this referred to as Southwest Asia. So, little bit of context. Prior to World War II, if you remember the videos about the interwar period, a lot of the territory of the Middle East was mandated, and remember this is the work of the League of Nations, so this area was mandated to the UK and France to guide them to independence. And remember, at the time, we kind of thought of this as another form of colonialism. So during the interwar period in the 1930s, most of these countries became independent. So we'll list a few of them here: Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and one in particular that we're going to take a closer look at here is Iraq. So Iraq became independent in 1932. And if you remember, when we looked at maps of the Middle East, and particularly the map of Iraq, the borders were pretty meaningless. Essentially, the British and the French just drew straight lines on a map and created a country and called it Iraq. The borders were meaningless. They're not natural borders. And they don't reflect religious or cultural or national boundaries. So what you end up with is a bunch of different people who don't want to be in the same country with each other. And that leads to a lot of internal conflicts. So we have Sunni versus Shia conflicts inside of Iraq. We have Arab versus Kurdish conflicts inside of Iraq. And all of this leads to instability. And while there were a few attempts that were made to unify the region in the 1950s and the 1960s, they all failed. And by the late 1960s, this party called the Ba'ath Party they come to power and align themselves with the Soviet Union. And because this is happening during the Cold War, you can't simply align yourself with the Soviet Union and not expect there to be a consequence of that. So, in response to that, the United States starts supporting Iraq's rival and neighbor, Iran. And we'll talk more about the consequences of that in a future video. The other place that we need to talk about is in Palestine. Now, Palestine has been brought up before. Remember, in 1917, the British promised the Jews could have Palestine as their homeland after World War I. This was this Balfour Declaration. And so after that was published, we start to see a migration of Jews to Palestine. And this starts to displace the Palestinians. The population density of Palestine goes up as more people come to Palestine. World War II increases this migration. The rise of Hitler, the violence of World War II, the Holocaust, all of that speeds up migration to Palestine, making it more and more unstable. And so now we start to see conflicts between the Jews and the Palestinians. In one of their first actions, the United Nations steps in to mediate. And seeing that it kind of worked in India, they decide to come up with a two-state solution. Basically, they're going to split Palestine in half. The Arab countries reject this plan. And in response to that, the Jews declare the state of Israel. So they say that we are now an independent country called the State of Israel. And this happens in 1948. In response to this, the Arabs attack Israel. Israel is supported by the United States, and the Arabs are supported by the Soviet Union. And because this is happening during the Cold War, you can't simply have a fight without getting involved in the Cold War. So Israel supported by the United States, all of the Arab countries attack Israel. Israel wins. And Israel wins again in 1956, 1967, 1973, and 1982. So these wars keep happening about every 10 years or so, and every time the Israelis win. We will probably come back to this idea again in our final thoughts as we wrap up the course, but this is the start to the Israeli-Palestinian crisis. We're going to move on now to Africa, but for the moment stay in the Islamic world because we're going to look first at Egypt. A little bit of context about Africa. Not much has changed when we think about what's going on in Africa. African colonies still want independence. but something has changed. But now they have a wealthy and powerful backer in the Soviet Union who will back them up. So before they wanted independence, and they were just asking for it and doing their best, but now the Soviets will back up the Africans when they want independence. So the first place we're going to look at here is Egypt. Now, Egypt was one of these mandated countries, so they were independent before World War II. But we're going to pick the story up in 1955. There was a military coup that brought Gamal Abdul Nasser to power. And Nasser is a really important leader because he's an important African leader. So Africans look to him, Arabs look to him, and he's a leader of the non-aligned movement. So he's an important Arab, African, and non-aligned leader. He does a number of important things, one of which is going to call back to something we talked about at the very, very beginning of all of this stuff. He built, or had built, a huge hydroelectric plant on the Nile. And this provided electricity to Egypt and their neighbors. But it did stop the Nile flooding. So for thousands of years, the Nile flooded and provided the Egyptians with very rich soil to plant in. But now I guess it was more important to have this hydroelectric plant to provide electricity. They've got enough food to eat, I guess. The other thing that Egypt does, or that Nasser does, is he nationalizes the Suez Canal. And we've seen this word nationalize before. Nationalize means that the government takes control of it. And this is mostly so that Egypt can get the money from the canal. When this happens, three really powerful countries don't like this at all. The UK, France, and Israel all invade, and this happens in 1957. To force Nasser to give up the canal. And in one of the rare instances in which the United States and the Soviet Union agree, the United States and the Soviet Union both side with Egypt and tell the British, the French, and the Israelis to get out. They side with Egypt as long as everyone has access to the canal. And that's why the British, the French, and the Israelis invaded in the first place. Both the British and the French have invaded Egypt before, and they were afraid that Egypt would not allow them to use the canal. Egypt had just finished fighting with Israel. They were one of the countries that invaded. And so all three of them have reason to believe that Egypt would cut them off of the canal. So as long as everyone had access to the canal, and the United States and the Soviet Union supported that, everybody got to use the canal, and Egypt got all the money from the canal. So more or less everybody wins. The next two places we're going to look at, we're going to do simultaneously. We're going to compare them. So we're going to compare here Ghana and Kenya. These are both British colonies. But Ghana's situation is going to be very different than what happens in Kenya. Ghana was the first African colony to become independent. This happens in 1957. And more or less, the leader of Ghana, his name is Kwame Nkrumah, kind of follows Gandhi's example, more or less. And so this is a negotiated political settlement. That more or less ends up peaceful. On the other hand, Kenya was much more violent. And I think the big difference here is that in Kenya, there were a large number of white British settlers who did not want independence. And so we get a more violent war that eventually ends with Kenyan independence in 1963. Now, the last place we're going to look at in Africa, and we'll probably come back to this one again at the end as we're wrapping up too, is South Africa. Now, South Africa is another one of these cases that they were already independent leading into World War II. So they were independent in 1931, and they're mostly kind of like Canada in that regard. So they were just given more and more autonomy until they were finally just kind of on their own in 1931, same as Canada. South Africa was ruled in a unique way. They were ruled by a small, and when I say small, I mean a really small, 10 to 15% of the population, a small white ruling class. And they ruled through a policy of official racism called apartheid, which in Afrikaans, the language of South Africa, pretty much means separateness. And as you can imagine, the large black population resisted this. And some resisted violently. Now, into this is where we get the most famous South African, Nelson Mandela. Now, Nelson Mandela was a leader of this resistance, and he was jailed for 27 years. And he became a symbol of South African repression. And because of this, South Africa was shunned by everyone. The Western world shunned South Africa. The Soviets shunned South Africa. No one would do business with South Africa. And so this pressure forced the end of apartheid and Mandela was released from prison in 1990. And then he ran for president of South Africa. And won in 1994, becoming the first black president of South Africa. So we're going to stop here. So now we've kind of done one last go through of India, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, most of Africa. In our next set of videos, we're going to cover the last places that we haven't quite looked at. So we're going to look at China. We're going to take one last look at Persia. And then finally, one last look at Latin America before we kind of wrap things up by ending the Cold War and kind of doing a quick look at the modern world and seeing where has all of this left us. So with that, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.